Hey y'all, in today's episode, we're going to be joined by Dr. Louis Markos, who many of you might already know. Unfortunately, Phil wasn't able to join us for this interview, so I have Rachel Rigdon here with me, who joined us right at the end of the Silver Chair.
Hey, I'm so excited to be back.
We are excited to have you back as well. We spent a lot of time in the Silver Chair, well, not a lot of time, really just the beginning and end of the book, getting a little bit more insight into Lewis's own views on education. This is obviously a pretty strong area of interest for me and for you too, Rachel. And so we've invited Dr. Markos onto the show to discuss his book, C.S. Lewis, An Apologist for Education. Now, unfortunately, I will say to our listeners that we had some substantial audio issues near the beginning of our interview, so I had to make a few edits to the show. And usually if I have to make edits in post or anything, I just don't mention it, except that, as fate would have it, I promise this was not my doing, all of the questions that had audio issues were questions that you had asked, Rachel.
I smell a rat.
Yes, exactly. So I'm only mentioning it to listeners, not to give a little, look behind the curtain here, but instead, I just don't want anyone to be jarred by only hearing your first question about like 15 or so minutes into it and hearing your voice for the first time and being a little, maybe taken aback.
That's helpful.
Phil sounds really different than he used to, So I just want to mention that to listeners. And again, we wanted to thank Dr. Markos for coming onto the show, giving us his time and attention, and just sharing a lot of wisdom and knowledge with us. So with that said, let's go ahead and get to the interview. Well, hello, and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel, and this is a podcast where we usually journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. We are currently in between seasons, and today Rachel and I are joined by Dr. Louis Markos. Dr. Markos, as some of you might already know, is a professor of English and scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University, where he holds the Robert H. Ray Chair in Humanities and teaches courses on British Romantic and Victorian poetry and prose, the classics, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and art and film. He has published 21 books and 2 lecture series. His works that will be of particular interest to our listeners are C.S. Lewis, An Apologist for Education, and The Life and Writings of C.S. Lewis, which is a lecture series available from the Great Courses. Dr. Markos, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
We're really excited to be able to speak with you today, Dr. Markos. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Dr. Markos, we are so excited to have you on the show today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. But before we start talking about your book, C.S. Lewis, An Apologist for Education, would you mind telling us just a little bit more about yourself and how you came to love the works of C.S. Lewis?
I'm actually a Yankee from New Jersey. I grew up over there, and I went to Colgate University, where I majored in English and history, and then on to University of Michigan for the master's and PhD with a dissertation on Wordsworth. Now, you need to understand, I was born in 1964. So when I went to school, there were no classes on C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien for that point. But I always loved Lewis. I read the Chronicles of Narnia early enough that I didn't know the Christian element. I just enjoyed them as stories, but later on I went back and enjoyed them more. And now probably every other year I teach a course on Narnia. I grew up Greek Orthodox. All 4 of my grandparents are from Greece. And I was saved, came to know Christ in the Greek Orthodox Church. And what's interesting is our priest, he liked to use the word born again Christian of himself. He was a very strong believer. And when we graduated levels of Sunday school, instead of giving little books about Greece, which is what Greeks do, I remember getting a copy of the Screwtape Letters and of Mere Christianity. So that was maybe when I was 15, 16, 17. And they profoundly shaped the way I thought about Christianity. And I remember 10 years later going back and reading them again and saying, wow, the way I think about Christianity and so many things was so shaped by Mere Christianity and Screwtape Letters. It's amazing. Now, again, I was always reading C.S. Lewis. But again, it wasn't really an academic subject yet. And then way back, I think it was 1999, the Great Courses brought me out to do a series called Plato to Postmodernism, Understanding the Essence of Literature and the Role of the Author. It's very long. It's about what they call literary theory or literary criticism. It's a little bit of a mixture of theology, philosophy, and criticism. And it did really, really well. And they said, we'd like you to do another one. What would you like to do? And I said, well, I'd love to do one on the Iliad and the Odyssey, already done. I'd like to do one on Greek tragedy, already done. I'd like to do one on Greek mythology, already done. Well, what's left? I said, well, I've always loved C.S. Lewis, and this is 2000. And, even then, he's getting more and more popular, and they said, do it. So I spent the next year rereading everything by C.S. Lewis, taking cross-references. That's how you learn something, kind of like I did when I was in grad school. And then I put together the 12 lecture series. And then from that, somebody asked me to be a speaker at a conference, and I put together 3 speeches on Lewis. And then that became an article in Christianity Today. It's kind of funny. Back in 2001, I had the cover article in Christianity Today, Myth Matters, about C.S. Lewis. And just last year, I had a cover article about the classical Christian education movement. So it's kind of come full circle for me. But anyway, that really did well. And Broadman and Holman asked me to write a book sort of based on that article. So I expanded it. And that was my first published book, Lewis Agonistes, How C.S. Lewis Can Train Us to Wrestle with the Modern and Postmodern World. And since then, I've been writing more and more books about Lewis, speaking about Lewis, conferences. I've become very much a part of the classical Christian education movement, and they really look upon Lewis as one of their founding fathers. And so it's just everywhere I turn. I'm also very much an apologist and write about that. And so, Lewis has been with me, every year, coming back, coming more, finding more and more wisdom there.
I'd love to just ask you just a couple of short questions about Lewis and his own life as an educator. I know some of our listeners might be familiar with what exactly he was doing at Oxford and then later at Cambridge when he goes there in the mid-50s. Could you just share with us a little bit about what his life was like as an educator? What was he teaching? What was he fascinated by? And what was that like for him? Why did he, for instance, never get a professorship at Oxford and all those things?
Right. Okay. Now, first of all, we need to understand that the British model is very different than ours. The British model is done by a tutorial method, where the professor meets with 1, 2, no more than 3 people, and they meet once a week, and the student has a reading list, right? They're reading all these great books, and usually each week they write an essay, a reflection essay, basically, that they read out loud to the tutor. I don't understand how this works. I could not possibly grade an essay that was read out loud to me. I don't know. Maybe there would certainly be grade inflation if I was doing that. That's what they do, right? And by the way, Lewis makes fun of that in The Horse and His Boy, which I know you're getting to soon. In The Horse and His Boy, as Aravis is about to tell her story, Lewis says it's sort of like students reading out loud their papers. The only difference is everybody wants to hear a story by Aravis. Nobody I know wants to hear those essays. So it's really, you can see Lewis just getting, I'm tired of this, right? And what happened was, so that was the education. It was a very hands-on education, a dialogue kind of education. But the professors would also give lectures. But believe it or not, the lectures were voluntary. But Lewis's lectures were so good that everybody would attend them. Now, if they liked you and you published and whatnot, instead of just being a tutor, you would eventually be given a professorship. It's a little bit like being a full professor, but not exactly. It's more like getting a chair. Like, for instance, I have the Robert H. Ray Chair in Humanities. That does not mean I am the chairman of Humanities. It means that I get a little bit of release, and instead of teaching 4 classes in the fall and 4 in the spring, I teach 3 and 3, giving me a little bit more time to do the writing and the speaking and all that I do. Well, a professorship pretty much relieves you of all those tutorials, which is very, very time consuming, and you spend more of your time lecturing and writing books. Lewis was never given a professorship at Oxford, even though he was one of the best lecturers, had published things like The Allegory of Love and Preface to Paradise Lost, a lot of books that were the English literature in the 16th century, part of the Oxford History of English Literature, very, very highly respected books, and he still wasn't given tenure. Now, why not? Part of it was because Lewis was very open about his faith. But there's two other things we don't often realize. They were upset at Lewis for daring to write and speak outside of his specialization, right? So Lewis was not a trained theologian, though he knew better than most theologians, but he still wrote about that, right? And one of the things, see, almost everybody listening to this probably considers Lewis a role model, but I'm lucky. Lewis is a double role model for me because I'm an English professor. And one of the things Lewis not only gave me the permission to be a Christian with a mind and still an academic, right? He also gave me the permission to be a generalist. One of the big problems with modern academia comes out of Germany is we are overly specialized. It is ridiculous. Now, if I've got something wrong with my eyes, I guess I want to go to an eye specialist. We need specializations in engineering and science, but we overdo it in the humanities. We need more humanities people that are Renaissance men, that are generalists. And Lewis had a specialty, but he dared to be a generalist in a specialized age. And he was partly punished for that, right? And Lewis dared to be a popularist. He dared to take ideas out of the academy and make them popular. Now, Lewis never dumbs it down. And again, it's a kind of academic envy. And Lewis was getting his hand slapped for that. But thankfully, Cambridge, who should get a lot more kudos than Oxford. Oxford doesn't deserve all the kudos they get because they didn't treat Lewis that well. Cambridge invented a chair specifically for Lewis called the Chair of Medieval and Renaissance Literature that they created for Lewis. And then Lewis was given more free time to write. You know what it's like? You probably heard of a book. Actually, it's pretty terrible, but it's called Love Story by a guy named Eric Siegel. Eric Siegel was a classicist at, I can't remember, something like Dartmouth or something like that. And he was never given tenure. And nobody would admit it, but I think they were punishing for writing a modern, very successful romance novel that was turned into, you probably heard of Love Story.
That's right.
Yeah.
Anyway, now, of course, that book is not as good as Lewis's books, but again, it's kind of this, we're punishing you for daring to be popular. And so, but Lewis knew that when he did the broadcast talks, that's when he spoke over BBC radio during the bombing of London, explaining what the Christian worldview was. Winston Churchill said, "Will Christian civilization survive?" Lewis tried to help them understand what Christian civilization is. He was beloved, but that actually made Oxford look down on him. How dare you do popular stuff on BBC that's not even your area of specialization? Even Tolkien sometimes gave him a hard time about it. For doing that. It's interesting. So he was courageous.
Yeah. If any of our listeners would be interested in looking more into his academic works, which I know quite a bit of them are still published, where's a good place to start? Do you go right to the Discarded Image? Do you jump into 16th century? Where's a good place?
Yeah, I would say that the first part to start, I think the most accessible is A Preface to Paradise Lost.
Okay.
About Milton, but it's also got excellent chapters about the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and Beowulf. They're
great.
Just on their own. I think that's much more accessible. I think that Allegory of Love and the English literature, I think, are very difficult for the specialists. Now, if you're not at all a teacher or anything, probably the most accessible academic book Lewis wrote is called An Experiment in Criticism. And I think that was what you were referencing before, Rachel, earlier. That talks about reading and the love of reading. And I've talked to a lot of people who are not into the humanities at all, but they really like that book. I've found that the non-academic people will actually really like that book because it gives you sort of, again, permission to love literature as literature, to immerse yourself into the story and all that sort of stuff. So that's probably the best place to start. It's also quite short. And then finally, it's a little bit more technical, but I do enjoy the Discarded Image for laying out the medieval, the medieval cosmological view. Now, if you're a real Narnia lover, you want to read a book by Michael Ward called Planet Narnia, in which he links up the 7 Narnia books to the 7 medieval planets. If you read that book and you like it, then you might want to read The Discarded Image. Now, I should tell you, Planet Narnia is the original book, but then he wrote a little bit easier, more accessible book called The Narnia Code. So you might want to start with the Narnia Code. The Planet Narnia is accessible. It's not, it's not crazy, but it is a little bit harder. Narnia Code's a little bit easier if you want to start there. But again, you need to understand that Narnia is a medieval place. And by reading and entering into and loving Narnia, we are not only learning intellectually about the Middle Ages, we are learning how it felt to live in a world where nature was alive and we lived in a sympathetic universe, and nature was not our house, it was our home, where we did not study nature like a machine, but nature was like a poem to be loved.
Yeah, when you were talking, it reminded me of another passage in your book. This is on page 40, but you were talking about how you were, looks like, summarizing an essay that Lewis wrote called On Three Ways of Writing for Children, and how he makes this distinction between readers who experience literature as a sort of wish fulfillment, this is sort of inflates the ego, as opposed to the type of story where a young person is sucked into the world. Their attention is on the world that the writer has conjured and the hero's place in the world. And it just seemed, I was thinking of most of the young adult, most contemporary books now are exactly in the first category, where children are simply, sort of an obsession with being the most popular one, being the star athlete, and how that is distinct from being a hero in a world where those values are undergirded.
Yeah, Lewis called those school stories. And that's the one where you're the picked on kid, and then suddenly you become the leader of the team.
The popular kid, right.
All that, and of course, a lot of that's going on today, except it's gotten worse because the first half of the story is they're a victimization and all that sort of stuff that just never ends. And all that does, Lewis said, and he's right, is breed envy and pride. It doesn't actually breed any virtue in you, right? Now, he says, and this is important all because he says that true fantasy is good. Now, this is important because especially if you grew up in a very, very conservative evangelical home, they often told you fantasy is evil because it's about magic. It's Harry Potter or something like that. Something like that, right? And Lewis says, no. Real fantasy, like the Lord of the Rings or something like that, what that breeds in children is not a sense of envy and pride and what's the word I want, and entitlement. It doesn't do that. It breeds in them a sense of awe and wonder and humility, right? Because they're brought into a world that they are in awe of. But in that world, they understand that there really is good and evil, virtue and vice, right and wrong. And as somebody wrote, so it's sort of summing up G.K. Chesterton, right? Fairy tales don't teach children that there are dragons. Children already know there are dragons. What you get in a fairy tale is the knowledge that the dragon can be defeated, okay? But you often need extra help, divine help, or you need, to use Lewis's phrase, you need to gain a chest. You need to learn a kind of courage to stand against that. So fairy tales do not breed envy or pride. They give us joy, wonder, awe, humility, and real virtue, real courage.
Yeah, another conversation that's related, we talk about using literature to give children new eyes to see the world, as opposed to finding literature that's a mirror where they see their own experience reflected in it. And this is a real tension between a modern or postmodern education and a classical education. And it makes book selection for children really critical.
It really does. What was it? This is the example that all preachers love to use. What were those famous flyers called? Is it the Blue Angels, the ones that fly in perfect formation?
Oh, yeah. I can't remember
I
what
don't
they're
know.
called. I know what you're talking about.
You probably know what I'm talking about. And apparently, and a long time ago, this group that flies in perfect formation, I guess there was a mistake, and one of them overshot and went down and blew up, and they all followed him and blew up. Okay.
No.
The image is that, this idea, the role of the arts is not to reflect society as it is. The role of the arts is to hold up an image of goodness, truth, and beauty for society to live up to. And everybody always uses that excuse when they produce art that is ugly, that is base, that is vulgar, that is evil, right? Well, I'm just reflecting the society. Well, if you're doing that, you're abdicating your role as an artist. You are misusing your God-given gifts. Now, that doesn't mean great art doesn't have ugliness in it, but great art ultimately wants to lift up humanity, show us our flaws, show us our need, but it's not there to merely reflect decadence. It's there to hold up a counter vision. And that's what Lewis does. He doesn't shy away. All of his children's heroes are always making big mistakes, and they need to confess and repent and feel remorse and understand what they did wrong. Aslan puts every kid through what I call a little catechism. The child not only has to know exactly what he did wrong, he has to know why he did it wrong and why he could have avoided it. And sometimes Aslan will ask a whole series of questions and answers until finally Jill says, well, I was showing off at the beginning. And that is a good answer, human child, right? So it's not, again, it's not about, goody two shoes and all goodness and light. There is real evil. My gosh, in Middle Earth, there's real evil. But we recognize that evil as evil and we resist it. And even if we are defeated, we understand that there's a greater hope. Beautifully embodied, of course, in Sam, who's the ultimate embodiment.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's a really great point. And I want to take a step back and go, Dr. Markos, you mentioned talking about, Lewis writing these fairy stories. And in your book, and I think some of our listeners might be aware of this too, Lewis, as he's writing the Chronicles of Narnia, for instance, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he is writing them because he's not seeing enough criticism around them. He's not seeing enough people studying them and giving them the value. Same with children's literature that he feels like they deserve.
People don't understand this, Daniel, but in the late 19th century, 1890s into 1910, that was the golden age of children's literature. We had George MacDonald writing his, at the back of the North,
Princess and
Curdie, Princess and Curdie, and the more adult Lilith and Fantastes. We've got Rudyard Kipling writing the Jungle Book. We've got Beatrix Potter writing about Peter Rabbit and all those other animals. We've got Alice in Wonderland, of course. We've got a golden age of great children's literature. But after World War I, Europe got all wised up, right, in a negative sense. They became cynical and skeptical, and they looked down on fantasy. And what they did, as Tolkien once said, when old furniture goes out of style, they put it in the nursery. Well, that genre went out of style, and so they shoved it over to the nursery to be reading to children. And both Lewis and Tolkien said, a book that's only worth reading by children is probably not worth reading at all. And so a sort of cynicism set in, especially between the wars, World War I and World War II, and it fell out of favor. We don't realize it because today children's literature has a pretty high reputation. But in great part, we have Lewis and Tolkien to thank for that. Lewis also helped but helped start science fiction with his space trilogy or Ransom. Right? And the Inklings, okay, most of your viewers probably heard of the Inklings. Now, they were all Christians, but this was not a Bible study as we think of it. They certainly brought up Christ, but it was a group of Christians writing works, and they would read out loud their works in progress. And many of them were writing in genres like fantasy and children's literature that had fallen out of style. And although the Inklings was a very critical group, I mean, they, if they found weakness, they would go for it and they would really critique each other. But they were also a support group in supporting people to keep writing this. Lewis did not help Tolkien write The Lord of the Rings, but Lord of the Rings might never have been finished if it wasn't for Lewis's encouragement and pushing him, publish this, all of that sort of stuff. And there's a famous story that one day Lewis and Tolkien were taking a walk. They were big walkers. And as they were walking, they were complaining to each other, why is it that nobody writes anymore the kinds of stories we love, things that sort of are adult, but they have a sci-fi, a fantasy element, things like Dante's Divine Comedy or Gulliver's Travels or The Fairy Queen, why does nobody write that anymore? And then Lewis or Tolkien, they debated about who. One turned to the other and said, you know what? It looks like we're going to have to write the kinds of books we want to read. and they set out and did it. Isn't that
Sure.
wonderful? We need to do that as well. We need to go out there and write the books that we want to read, and maybe we'll revive them.
Well, this is sort of a natural segue. So Daniel and I talk a lot about how to help our students relate to literature properly, because we find that they are unwilling to move beyond narrative. I mean, just the engrossing story.
Well, and not even just our students. Like I think I'm often like that. Like I have to push back within myself that sometimes I that's my tendency can be to fall back on that.
Yeah, totally. And So and also evaluating literature in terms of personal preference. Like, is it interesting to me or not? Do I like it or not? So in chapter 2, you distinguish Lewis from this is a quote, old-fashioned teachers who take an overly technical approach to literature and treat it as an artifact to be studied rather than a work of art to be loved, which I agree. And here's the practical question. What is your advice for teachers or parents or just readers who find themselves needing to teach discrete skills of analysis as a way to help kids find their way into more substantive conversations and to move beyond thinking in these subjective terms of just what do I like and I don't like, without turning a book into a biology dissection?
That's a good question, because we do need to teach critical skills. We need to teach them how to evaluate and how to discern. Now, one of the things that makes literature different than, say, a math question is, in any good work of literature, when you're interpreting, there is more than one right answer. But there are wrong answers, okay? So they need to understand that this is not anything goes. But it is true that there is more than one possible level of interpretation and evaluation. So there is more wiggle room, say, than in math or something like that. That's important. Right? Because we can wrestle and we can dialogue with this great story, with this great book. But they need to understand, and what Lewis said is, please don't take the story and impose your own modernist worldview on it. Allow the story to speak for itself. One of the quotes I have in there, Lewis said, instead of studying and therefore looking down on the medieval knight, why don't you put on his armor and look at the world through his visor and see it? So I like to call this genial criticism. Lewis says, let's be fair. Lewis called chronological snobbery, where our modern age is all right and they're all wrong. But we also want to avoid the other thing and say, well, just because it's old, it must be 100% right. We do need them to learn how to wrestle with it. But we need to begin with a sense of respect and even awe and wonder from this great work that has survived the ravages of time. So let's read this. Let's try to understand it on its own terms. But then let us engage our own critical apparatus and discuss it, right? So we want to avoid, questioning everything like the 60s, but we also want to avoid just kowtowing to it just because it is written by a dead old guy, right? So the proper respect, but we need to teach a critical dialogue with it. And, we do that by, teaching them, just simple things. Let's look at the characters. Let's look at theme. Let's look at point of view. I mean, all of these tried and true methods are good. And Lewis, did not throw those out. He just didn't want to reduce it to, okay, let me give you the best example of this is Lewis's friend Tolkien. Tolkien is universally considered to have written the first great major essay about Beowulf. Now remember, Beowulf was only found again, 100 or so years ago.
Sure.
Before Tolkien wrote his famous essay, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. Before he wrote that, most of the people that studied Beowulf studied it as an artifact of the past. They didn't even care about the story. It's an artifact. They used it to study linguistics, how does Anglo-Saxon or Old English work? They did it but they never looked at the story as a story. And Tolkien, of course, was a great philologist, and he could be just as pedantic as any great intellectual academic, right? But he also loved the story and wanted to understand the worldview of Beowulf, to understand its special kind of heroism, even its fatalism. And of course, all of what Tolkien learned from the Beowulf frame of mind was transported perfectly into the Rohirrim, the riders of Rohan, in The Lord of the Rings. The only difference is he gave them horses. Nobody has horses in Beowulf. Well, there is one Coast Guard guy that has a horse, but nobody's.
Yeah, that's right.
There's one guy. And so he's basically making perfect Anglo-Saxons, Beowulf plus horses, and we get Rohirrim. So that's what we want to do. But also, just as important, and this may sound subjective, but it's not, your students need to see that you love and value this work and have learned from it, or they're not going to learn from it.
That's so true.
I think Lewis serves as such a great example of that, as someone who, is writing these books for many of us that are still enjoying them, obviously 70 years later, if you think of Narnia, and yet it was so clear how much he loved these things. Like I look to him in my own classroom as an example where, like, for instance, when my students eventually found out about the podcast, and they were like, so you mean you read the books we do in class just for fun at home? And I was like, that's mostly what I do. Like, I actually spend more time outside of this classroom doing stuff that we would do in class. I read Dante for fun. I know that's hard for you to believe. And I think I've learned some of that from Lewis himself, who loved these great works of literature and who just immersed himself in these worlds while also writing it. He was both taking it in, but then also sharing it with others.
I think I mentioned it in my book, Apologist for Education, but Lewis famously called himself a dinosaur.
Yes.
Now, let's talk about that. He gave a speech and he said, look, I am in my bones an old European man. When I read medieval and early Renaissance stuff, I read it not as a tourist, but a native. I feel it in my bones and I love it. And he says, therefore, even if you don't agree with my love of this, my love of it is itself a datum and a fact. And you can at least study me as an artifact of an old European man. He says, look, there's only so much you can learn about a dinosaur by studying the bones. But if a dinosaur walked into this room, right, even as you ran away in terror, wouldn't you cast a backward glance to see what it looked like, how it moved, how it smelled, right? It would tell you things that no bones. He says, look, I would give anything to listen to any Athenian, even a stupid ancient Athenian, talk about Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus, right? They would tell me things without realizing they were telling me because they're a native. So Lewis was unashamed to refer to himself as a dinosaur. Someone, and by the way, Dorothy Sayers also adopted that for herself. She said she was a fellow dinosaur in a letter she wrote. And that we need to show them that we love this stuff. I love Dante as if it were written yesterday. Right? It's Screwtape Letters was written 80 years ago. Could have been written yesterday. Okay? Go back and show that sense of wonder and model in it your willingness. Okay, look, folks, a lot of people say, the dangers of bardolatry. That's the worship of the bard, specifically Shakespeare. But anyway, well, look, there is such a thing as a danger of bardolatry, but not today. Okay? As Lewis says in The Abolition of Man, the role of the modern educator is not to tear down jungles, it's to irrigate deserts. Right? Our problem today is not an excess of enthusiasm. It is a loss of real enthusiasm and love for the classics. We could use a little bardolatry today of learning at the feet of the great authors.
I think that is a really great place for us to kind of conclude this conversation. Unless, Rachel, you had any more questions?
Nope. We were wondering how listeners can find and purchase your work.
The best place is go to Amazon.com and type in my name, Louis Markos with a K. It's Greek, Markos, and go to my Amazon author page. Okay. All 21 of my books are there. And if you want the teaching company, just go to their website because they sell specifically. But for all my books, just go to my Amazon author page. My newest book that I think a lot of folks will like is The Myth Made Fact, Reading Greek and Roman Mythology Through Christian Eyes. The other book that's very popular with classical folks is From Achilles to Christ, Why Christians Should Read the Pagan Classics. And my most popular book, I think of all, has been On the Shoulders of Hobbits. But The Myth Made Fact is a lot of fun. Also, go to YouTube and type in Louis Markos. And I've got a YouTube channel with lots of free videos that you can watch.
Oh, nice.
I started putting that together during the quarantine.
Sure.
So that's a good place. All different topics. If you just go there, you'll find different things there. But again, the Amazon author page is the best place to go.
Well, Dr. Markos, I actually have one more question for you, if that's all right. I was thinking as you kind of wrap some of that up, I'm thinking a lot about the way in which Lewis kind of, and we already had spoken about this, he kind of lets us put on the armor of the medievals as we enter into Narnia. And I think even for myself, as someone who has now spent a lot of time reading these books, the Chronicles of Narnia, I mean, I do feel like I, just by hearing the Narnians speak and think, I have a better understanding of what it was like for the medievals to exist in this world, very different than our own. So I think that is a great place for many of us to kind of begin. You also just mentioned, as you listed some of your other books about, the pagan myths, the pagan classics. Could you, one of the things that I think is really difficult, even for myself as someone who teaches, ancient history, and I read the Iliad and the Odyssey with my students, I think this whole idea behind Lewis looking at the Christ story and say this is the one true myth is sometimes in our culture, even in Christian culture, is so difficult for us to understand what Lewis is saying there. What's the best way to explain what Lewis and even Tolkien and then Hugo Dyson, what are they thinking when they say all of these myths were pointing towards the true myth?
Good. See, there is a difference between data and the interpretation of data. If you went to a public school, you took social studies in 6th grade because nobody teaches history in the public school. It's only social studies, which is very different. And you read the Epic of Gilgamesh. Mm-hmm. That was worth reading. And there's a flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And if you had a teacher trained in the whole John Dewey progressive thing, even if she was a Christian, she still might have said, now children, we now know that every ancient culture has a story of a universal flood. That just goes to show that the biblical story is nothing more than a myth. Now, I remember even as a child thinking, there's another way to interpret that data, right? If every single ancient culture has a story of a global flood, that says to me there probably was a global flood, and maybe every other culture only maintained the mythic element of that, but only in the Bible, under divine inspiration, does Moses give us the more historical account. Okay, it is true that Osiris, Adonis, Tammuz, Mithras, Balder, the ancient world is filled with what we would call dying and rising gods, mostly because they're tied to the seasonal cycle of life, death, and rebirth. And at first, Jesus sounds just like that. And so you might say, oh, Jesus is just a myth. But wait a minute. Why is it that all around the world, everybody has a story like this? Why this yearning for God to come to man? Why this understanding of taboo guilt? Why this need for life, death, and rebirth and all that stuff? Why? Well, it only makes sense if the creator who created us put that desire in us. Otherwise, why would it just evolve separately in all different areas, right? There seems to be a common human yearning for this archetype, as we call it. Well, doesn't it make sense then that when God actually historically fulfills that yearning, he would do it in a way that would answer those? Look, I don't know if this bothers you, but it used to bother me. Are you saying that before the coming of Jesus, God simply ignored 99% of the world and only cared about the Jews? Well, only to the Jews did God speak directly, what we call special revelation. Mm-hmm. But God did not ignore the rest of the people. He spoke through creation. He spoke through our conscience. He spoke through our reason. And he spoke through what C.S. Lewis called the good dreams of the pagans, right? Those yearnings. God has written eternity in the hearts of men. Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, says Augustine in the Confessions, right? All of those yearnings. Now, if when Jesus came, he, yes, fulfilled all the messianic prophecies in the law and prophets, but he had nothing to say to the Gentiles, it would appear that a foreign God had invaded the world. But in fact, what we see is that Jesus Christ not only fulfills the Old Testament law and prophets, he fulfills all the highest yearnings and desires of the pagan people, the desires which are recorded in their myths. And so he's not just the Jewish Messiah, he's the Savior of the world. He is the true myth, as Chesterton called him. Because you know what? All those other myths are myths. You can't say when they happened because they're not historical. But Jesus of Nazareth died under Pontius Pilate in a real time, in a real place. And so Jesus is the historical corn king, as they call him.
Yeah.
But he's also still a myth that speaks to our deepest yearnings and desires and imagination. All of it comes together in Jesus. He is the desire of all nations.
Well, Dr. Markos, thank you so much for being with us. I think this has been a really fruitful conversation, and you have so much wisdom and knowledge. And I know that our listeners, Rachel and I obviously do, but our listeners as well, just appreciate that you've been willing to impart that upon us.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks for having me on, and keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you. Yeah. And so we'll look forward to sharing more of your books with our listeners and for your books that are coming out in the future, which is really exciting. And we're really grateful for a lot of the
By the way, I have a new book in the summer from InterVarsity Press. It's going to be called From Plato to Christ, How Platonic Thought Shaped the Christian Faith.
Oh, great.
So that's great.
Kind of instead of From Achilles to Christ, it's now From Plato to Christ. And that's coming out sometime in the summer.
Oh, great. Yeah, we'll definitely kind of post that and share that with our listeners as well, too. But yeah, there's a lot of great, you have a long list of great works for people to be able to dive into. And so I think that'll be exciting for many of them. So thank you again, Dr. Markos, for being with us. We really appreciate you sharing all that you have shared today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.